Welcome to everybody. My name is Carlos Cordon. I'm a professor here at IMD, and I'm joined from Copenhagen, my dear friend Kim Hald. He is a co-author of the book that we are going to present, and he is also a professor of supply chain in CBS. So, Kim, if you could introduce yourself just 1 minute.
Yeah, you said it already, at least where I am and my position. And I also worked with Carlos for quite some years, and also even were at IMD half a year, some years ago, and we established a relationship there. Now I'm a professor at CBS with a focus on supply chain management in a broad sense, and especially the upstream part with suppliers, right? So, yeah.
Thank you, Kim. So I'm a professor of supply chain for way too many years here, and we're going to talk about the book that we wrote with Kim a few years ago. So when the book club asked me for a good book about supply chain, I was looking at different books, and I found that this book is extremely, or even is more relevant than even before. We're having the discussion with Kim. Supply chain isn't the news. Supply chain is creating a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. And that book actually went over that and has become much more relevant than before. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss a little bit about the concepts that are in the book, what are the different concepts, what are the ideas, and particularly how relevant they are for today. So that's what we are going to do, and we're going to do that in a kind of dialogue with Kim. So if at any point in time you have any question, please write it in the chat. We will try to elaborate on that. Now, logically, as you read the news, you realize that there is a lot of things going on. And one of the things that to us is interesting is that the first chapter of that book, it talks about thinking from a strategic point of view about the supply chain. And it's extremely important today. Let me give you one example. Traditionally, supply chain has been about reducing cost, improving service, maintaining the quality, but the objective has been try to reduce cost as much as is possible, given that you fulfill the needs of the service that we agreed and the quality. Let me take one example of what has happened very recently. I took three car companies, GM, Ford, and Volkswagen. And if you read the news, all of them, they say, we have cut production because we didn't have enough microchips. Even in some of you trying to buy a car, probably you are being told, well, the waiting times are very long. Now, look at those companies. I took these three companies and I look at the number of cars they sold in 2019, before the pandemic, and the number of cars they sold in 2021, last year. And it is true, they sold around 20% less cars, something like 3-4 million less cars than in 2019. So you would say, wow, what a missed opportunity. Customers are waiting, they want to buy cars and you cannot sell them. But then I look at the profits, and it turns out that these three companies made 48% higher profits in 2021 than in 2019. So it's like something is different here. Yeah. So what did they do? Well, like most companies, they thought, let's not reduce prices. Let's increase prices. And by the way, given that we have a limited supply of microchips, let's make the models that actually are the highest in profitability. And also let's take out some options. So if you want to buy a car in the style we buy in Europe, which is we buy the car new, and we say these are the options that we want. Some car companies will tell you, oh, this option is not available anymore. This option is not available, because they are basically thinking about supply chain together with finance, together with marketing, with sales, and they try to optimize the whole thing. That's precisely what the first chapter is about. How do we make sure that we think about supply chain not just as a cost center, but as part of the business? And today even has become much more important than before. And even I remember talking to some supply chain officers in fast-moving consumer good companies. They were saying the common theme is we sell everything that we can produce. So the more we can produce, the more profits we have. That's a dramatic change for supply chain, for a traditional supply chain, but is precisely the first chapter of that book about how do you think from a strategy point of view, how do you think about this is an opportunity, and how do you make the link between finance, sales, marketing, even product development and supply chain with the objective of maximizing the profit. So it has become extremely obvious. And if you want to look at that, I would say, many industries, the same has happened. So Kim, what's your take on that side?
Yeah, I can follow up on that. So I also, in the first chapter, we have this about the flows in the supply chain, right? And there we say, okay, it's not all about goods and information, right? So which is obvious, it's more. And this more is becoming even more important today. So what we are saying is that it's also about exchange of risks, exchange of personal relations, and exchange of other things, right? So it's, you need to think, even also today in this turbulent environment, you need to think about all these flows. And one thing we have there, which is also obvious today in the Corona pandemic and so on, is that you cannot really transfer a risk, right? In some sense, right? Of course, you can sign contracts, you can try to do code of conduct also in sustainability, but at the end of the day, the risk and the media exposure will hit you also as a focal firm, right? And we've seen multiple cases of that. The case we have in the book is about BP and oil disaster. But again, today with the COVID or multiple issues with sustainability, we see, fine, you have your contracts in order, but you better also have the whole supply chain in order, right? So I think that's an interesting thing that we see again and again. So think about not only these basic flows, but more flows, also flows of innovation, right? Which are fundamental, right? So I think this is what I would like to chip in here. Maybe also one more thing. This thing about the ecosystem, right? So it's not only about supply chains. We have this concept now also of an ecosystem where we think about how people come together to make or companies come together to make a solution, right? And that is the supply chain concept do not capture that as such. We need to think about it as an ecosystem where we have finance, as you say, Carlos, we have multiple things in place in order. And the key core strategic question is, where do you want as a firm to be positioned in that ecosystem, right? To gain your revenue. I find that also highly relevant today, right? Mm-hmm. So,
even and then building on what you say about the ecosystem, it's interesting to me that the second chapter we talk about precisely about the business model. Now we use one example that has proven even more interesting today, which is the example of Luxottica. For many of you know it, but for those who are not so familiar, Luxottica is the biggest manufacturer and seller and retailer in the world of glasses, sunglasses, prescription glasses. So it's interesting because it's a company that's vertically integrated. They make the sunglasses, they make the prescription glasses, they have the stores also. So it's vertically integrated. Now, the interesting thing is that today we see precisely this business model idea, this idea of in this ecosystem that precisely Kim was talking about, what is basically the idea of how do we have the ecosystem creating the value and where do we capture the value? And one example, which is very, very recent and very interesting, is very similar to Luxottica, is the example precisely in Denmark. If you compare two shipping companies, one is Maersk, the shipping liner, the other is MSC. And interestingly enough, the CEOs of both companies are called Cordon. Now, they follow two very different strategies. One is the strategy of Maersk liners, which basically they are doing a vertical integration. They are buying not only ships, they are also buying transport companies. They are buying companies that are doing basically the trading. So they try to say their strategy, they say now, is door to door. So before it was you will buy from somebody the cargo, from somebody else the fine distribution, and someone they are trying to do that. So we are going back to the idea of vertical integration and what's the business model behind it. Now, to me, it's a very interesting one because now we see a lot of companies also and exactly building on the idea of the ecosystem and the risks. trying to think about that, you might remember that not so long ago, some car companies, going back to the car industry, they were talking about, shall we build our own factories to make microchips? And even you see, somebody was asking about the geopolitical effects. And it's interesting, you see the US administration with Joe Biden at the head, looking at supply chains and trying to manage that, to influence that. They are specifically saying, for example, we are going to finance people to build microchip factories in the US. Probably we're going to see the same in Europe and so on. So what we see, all these geopolitical factors are making supply chains much more regional and quite often much more integrated, because the incentive is, and we were talking about that with Kim before, it's important that supply chain is a chain. So the performance is as weak as the weakest link. And what happened is that links that we thought were very strong, they have become very weak. So as a consequence, thinking about the business model, the strategy, how that influences the supply chain, that's actually the focus of the second chapter of that book, which is very much about this concept of what do we integrate, what we don't integrate, and the geopolitical effects are very strong. We were not able to police that in this chapter, but there are some companies that were saying there are trade sanctions against certain countries. So that means in order to supply to a certain country, we need to have the supply chain there. And we need to manage the supply chains, taking into account all the trade wars that exist. And even in the unfortunate events of these days, that's going to be even more strongly. So what's going to happen there? And the supply chains, basically, you probably read the news. Now, the car companies in Europe are stopping manufacturing because a lot of grouping cable were done in Ukraine. So they are saying immediately, we have a problem. You will see in the war in Ukraine is going to create also a lot of problems for many feedstock for the supply chain of food. So that means basically we are back at trying to understand what is the ecosystem, what is the supply chain, what are the risks, what do we integrate, what we don't integrate. And interestingly enough, if you remember until a few years ago, the issue was, how do we outsource to Asia? Now the question is the other way around. Have we gone too far? And to me, the last example that I would like to mention here is one of the surprises for many people who are experts in supply chain of what happened in the supply chain of Toyota. So many of you might know that Toyota created the famous Toyota production system, the idea of just in time, the idea of not having excess inventory in the supply chain. Actually, what happened when the pandemic started, everybody was surprised because actually Toyota didn't stop manufacturing for many months. So the question was, how have they done it? Well, the answer from Toyota was a simple one. In 2011, you remember the unfortunate tsunami in Japan. And then Toyota, they learned that there was a problem, a potential issue in the supply chain if there was not enough stock of microchips. So they went to their microchips, to their component suppliers, and they told them, we would like you to have 2 months of a stock of microchips. We'll pay for it, but just in case we need that stock. So actually, when the pandemic started and there was a lack of microchips, for 2 months, Toyota was able to do that thanks to working in the ecosystem with their suppliers. So that was a little bit the idea. The Toyota production system is a lot about learning. What did we learn from those effects? So that's very much a little bit this idea of this is the key driver of your business model. Kim, what would you add here?
Yeah, I would sort of try to take over from here in relation to especially risk, the risk part, right? Because now in the book we do not mention resilience as a concept, but I think today it's a lot about being resilient. So which would be the capability to survive in turbulent change, right? And the thing is also, as Carlos is mentioning, and we did some studies on that also recently, also based on the pandemic. So there would be what we call resilience capabilities, right? So what are they? They are sort of, you could say, could be so reactions to be more resilient. So the discussion today is whether we would have a lot of insourcing or regionalization. based on this. That's one issue that is discussed. Establishing redundancy, sort of stock and so on. So the funny thing here is that the really bad performers in stock management are some of the ones that came out really well in the pandemic, right? So they benefited sort of from the pandemic, that they had been not so good at managing their stocks. That's sort of a paradox, you could say, right? But we also found, of course, that there's a lot of discussion that there is now a need for more flexibility, visibility, and transparency in general. And then we also see a big discussion, and that could be an interesting thing to discuss also here or in your companies maybe already. What is the role of IT in all of this, right? What is the role of IT in supporting more resilience? From one perspective, we could say it's also a potential threat, right? That it can be. We've seen that in Maersk. There has been quite a few cases in Denmark, and I expect also other places. So Maersk were disrupted some years ago. We had William Demand producing hearing aids that were disrupted, that could not use the system for nearly 1 month. Think of that, managing your supply chain without systems for 1 month, right? And we have also recently Vestas, the big wind turbine producer. So I see that there is some really strategic decisions that need to be made in relation to what is the role of IT. On the one hand, there is an upside on resilience. On the other hand, there is also a potential downside, right? So one upside is also artificial intelligence, where we now have the capability to if we have the right data, to identify our deep suppliers, the problems with our deep suppliers that potentially are the keynotes in our supply network that can disrupt us. And that is here, artificial intelligence might be helpful. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. So then another chapter in the book is about basically something that has become also very, very relevant now, which is about the agility, the flexibility. How do you create a flexible supply chain, which actually, exactly as you said, Kim, is very related to the idea of resilience. So it's interesting because initially the idea of the supply chain, how is the supply chain process and how flexible is that, precisely with the dilemma of how efficient are we? And I think that many people say, we have gone too much in the example in the supply chains to be too efficient, whereas actually we need to be much more agile. It's interesting because there we go on the concept of the innovation. What is the role of agility in the supply chain to bring innovation to the market? And today what we see is that this concept particularly is relevant, not because only of innovation, but because also reaction to waves, to what's happening to some of the disruptions. And also because actually one thing that has happened is that the inertia of people in supply chain is to increase flexibility. So it's still a lot of companies are thinking, can we close factories? Can we increase the number or the utilization of our factories, of our supply chains? And then we have two dilemmas. One is precisely as we increase utilization and we increase efficiency, it becomes less flexible. It becomes less agile, but it becomes also more sustainable. So here is where we have these dilemmas that are very important to understand. How do we manage that? And I'm saying that because many people say, we should be more efficient, we should be more sustainable and more agile. Well, let me clarify that from two professors' point of view. That's a real dilemma. Yes, you would like or optimally to be super flexible and on top of it to be absolutely super efficient, but it's not possible. There is some trade-offs there. Now, you could improve both, but you need to be aware that, and I always use one example, if you want to use a facility 99%, the flexibility is very low. It's like in Switzerland, in some point in time, going to a medical doctor. You call them, unfortunately, they're so full that they tell you next appointment is in 2 months from now. Right? Now, it's not to complain about them, it's that there is a lot of demand and there is not enough supply. So, and there what we need to do is precisely to manage that. So, and it's important because those dilemmas reflect not only on the supply chain, but reflect also on sales and on profits, as we were talking. What are the ones that we are going to take? How do we create that? And if we think about the capital that we have in the supply chain, it's very important to understand we are putting a lot of capital. And there is another important thing. In the last years, quite a lot of companies, they said, well, we can have quite a lot of capital or stock in the supply chain. At the end of the day, the cost of capital is relatively low. Now, we see now the inflation going up. We see that, unfortunately, the cost of capital is going to go up. So those dilemmas are going to be also from a financial point of view, very, very important in the sense of what is the opportunity cost of not having the possibility of selling, what is the cost of having less efficiency, and what is the cost of capital that we're going to have. So from that point of view, we need to look at that. And finally, one of the things that is important is that on that chapter, we go very much about what is called the virtual supply chain, the idea of outsourcing versus insourcing. And that is very, very relevant. We use an example of the electronics industry. It's not the one of iPhone, but everybody's familiar with the iPhone, designed in California, assembled in China. Now, the interesting thing is that there is a lot of supply chains that are like that. And the key decision is not to insource all of it or to outsource all of it, is how do you manage the supply chain? And you probably read the news that actually the companies making phones now, they're looking rather than China, they're looking, shall they put a supply chain, not just the assembly, the whole supply chain in India, in other continents, in other places, precisely because of their geopolitical influence. And that's a very important one because it's not just putting the assembly, it's putting all of the suppliers. You need to put all the supply chain. So this is why that idea about the dilemmas that we have in flexibility versus efficiency is a very relevant one. Substantially, global companies, they exist because of something called economies of scale. We want to have big factories. We want to have big brands that are efficient in advertising, efficient in manufacturing, efficient in the supply chain. That's why we have global brands and global companies. On the other side, we need not to lose the opportunities, and that requires the agility. And that's a dilemma that every company, every global company is facing. Even small companies, they are facing that in the sense of how do we articulate the supply chain. So that to me is important. And as I said, is this dilemma of innovation, of agility and resiliency, of particularly sustainability, and how we are going to manage that. And I think that today, we used to have many people talk about the silo effect. So you supply chain, you manage this, you sales, you manage this, you finance, you manage this. What we see today is that we need to have a holistic view of all of that. And the last one is precisely about, to use one example that to me was very interesting. Everybody admires today a company called Tesla. Now, what did Tesla do when they had problems with microchips? Because they did also have problems, although it's much smaller as a number of cars that they make. And it was interesting that some people said, wow, it was interesting. They couldn't get all of the microchips they wanted, the type of microchips they wanted. So they look at, can we do something with the microchips that are available? And actually, many people praise Tesla because they were able to use microchips, the ones that were available, a little bit more commodity, to reprogram them and to provide some of the functions that the others are provided. So if you think about that, it was product development, innovation, working with supply chain, trying to overcome the challenges and become more flexible. So to me, that's the example of precisely how do we work, having taken into account the constraints that we have in the supply chain, and how do we make it not just the supply chain more flexible, but also from the product design point of view. How do we design the products to have a much more flexible supply chain? And then I remember in the case, we had the example of a company called Numico and ABB and Hewlett-Packard, how they did that precisely, thinking about that. And it's interesting because there, and for those of you in supply chain who have been working for years, you know it well, is the bullwhip effect. And now many people is rediscovering that, because the bullwhip effect basically means that when we have a small variation in one part of the chain, it propagates and amplifies in other parts of the chain. And that's exactly what we are seeing today for the last 2 years in the supply chains. I always use the example of something very funny, which is that in Switzerland, which is a very stable country, at the beginning of the pandemic, it turned out that people were buying 5 times more ravioli cans than before. And then the challenge for the manufacturer was, wait a minute, is this something that's going to continue or is this a blip? So the challenge was, is people going to consume more ravioli in cans, or is simply that they are stockpiling just in case? The manufacturer, with a lot of common sense, they realize it's not a change in demand, it's simply a panic buying. Let's keep the manufacturing, the volume as the same as before, things will go back to normal. So in that sense, that was normal. There's another example of another company in Switzerland, a company called Logitech. They produce these cameras, they produce these mouses. They observe also an increase in demand, but that was an increase in demand that was going to stay. We think about how much we have invested at home on buying mouses, cameras, computers, and everything because we work from home. So that's the dilemma that we face in many supply chains. Is this bullwhip effect something that is going to be temporary, or is actually representing a big change? So this is what is creating a lot of, I would say, instability. And logically, we need to think about the flexibility that we want in the supply chain and how do we design it for it. Kim, back to you. What is your take on that side?
There are so many things that I could take up from your talk here. So one thing is we have the bullwhip effect, but what we also see now is something called the ripple effect. There is a discussion. So ripple effect is really what we saw in the COVID, that these disruptions comes from multiple sides, like waves, and so at one time we are disrupted at our supply side, but suddenly also our demand increased at the downstream side, right? And we need to manage that, and that is also what you talk about, Carlos, in the sense that many are facing the dilemma that today whether these suddenly increases in demand because people were at home during the COVID. Are they staying? Are they permanent? Or are they not? So should we build up now more capacity on the short term? And will it stay? And when should we invest? So it creates a lot of dilemmas, right? And another thing here I would like to take up is this: how do we then handle product shortage on microchips, and as you talked about, right? And there we've seen a lot of cases where companies are forced to make product redesigns. So basically, they are mobilizing their product development in an agile manner, hopefully, right? So that is the capability that is needed, right, to handle a disruption like that or a shortage, right? So you simply mobilize your product development department, and that this also shows this about the need for integration of the supply function and the product development function, right? And another thing that I would like to say that we have seen is that this product shortage, in a way, I think you also said that when you were here at CBS, Carlos, this about that resilience, sustainability is sort of also coming together in a way, right? Or somehow where we see that also a company I referred to before, a market leader in hearing aid, D-Man, is now recycling their own microchips, right, from the old hearing aids in order just to self-supply, right? And so you need to find innovative new solutions in order to cope in this turbulent environment. One thing more I can say about this chapter about dilemmas, which is really one of my core areas of research also, is this about performance management, right? It's highly complex to maneuver when we have so many different requirements. So we need to be agile, we need to be cost efficient, we need to be innovative. So how do you create an incentive system in that environment, right? So that's really something that you need to think carefully about, because if you don't hit that on the nail, then you will sort of create a lot of frictions inside your company and in the supply chain that is basically waste, right? And maybe the final thing I could say here is also with maybe a little bit academic word, I'm not sure, ambidexterity, right? So being able to do all these things at one time, right? So on the one hand, be efficient, and on the other hand, be innovative, right? And there are many ways you can try to solve that knot. You can try to be innovative somewhere in your chain and efficient elsewhere, or you can really try to cope with this. And that is really a dilemma, right? So there are multiple dilemmas that if you want to beat the competitors, you better try to work on managing them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Build on that, there is an interesting question, is that somebody's asking, do you see the financial function more taking lead in strategic supply chain issues due to the ripple effect and short-term needed finances? The answer is absolutely yes. Let me clarify that. One of the challenges that I have seen over the years, we have in supply chain a very fundamental process we call the sales and operations process. And many of you are involved on that, is the starting point for many supply chains. Now, the issue is that still some companies, they don't have finance involved. For many companies, it has been always involved, but for some, they don't see that. Now, the reality of today is the following, and it's a very important one. When we talk about these dilemmas, the main dilemma is, shall we have more capacity to take opportunities, or shall we have less capacity and become more efficient? Let me use a very simple example. Imagine that you go to a restaurant and you could say, the restaurant might say, we are going to have 10 people working. If there is more customers coming, we cannot increase the size of the people they're working. Therefore, yes, they are fully booked, they are fully used. It's very efficient. We have low cost. We can attend 50 customers with 10 people. That's fantastic. If 60 come, we lose 10 customers. That's one option. And probably is an option that for a low cost, for an efficient restaurant, makes a lot of sense. A different option is to say, no, we are going to have, instead of 10 people working, we're going to have 15. Why? Well, sometimes these 15 will be working all the time. Sometimes there will be no customers. But at the same time, what happens is that we are much more flexible. The fact of having more capacity means you are more flexible. It's more costly. What is the trade-off? Well, we don't save money, but maybe we sell more. There are more customers coming. And we may need to take this decision. Let me go to a very specific example. Let's say you are a pharma company. You develop a new drug. Then the challenge that you have is we don't know how much we're going to sell. We might take two different options. One, we build a factory or supply chain to supply this amount of drugs. We believe that there is going to be so many customers. And you know what? We do that very efficient. We don't build a huge capacity. We chase are conservative. We call that conservative. We build this. Another option is to say, no, we are very bullish. We believe it's going to be a lot. There we build more capacity, more supply chain, transportation, everything. What is the difference? Well, the difference, and this is where it's not about being conservative or not. And I took a pharma company because pharma companies are the ultimate gamble. They invest in a lot of potential active ingredients. One of them succeeds, they make a lot of money. If none of them succeeds, they don't make. So they are a casino in that sense. In the nice way of we invest, we expect a return. Now, if we go back to my example, well, a conservative company might say we are conservative, we don't invest in a lot of capacity, we launch the drug, it sells well, fantastic. Yes. However, you might have forgotten revenue. You might have lost market share to your competitor. And that is where who is the one that is going to make the trade-off in money? It's finance. Finance is the one that could be the arbitrator saying this is how much it costs, option A. This is how much it costs, option B. This is how much we are going to earn in option A. And this is, we don't know how much we could earn in option B. It's an assessment. It's a typical example of finance using options. They call that option theory. How much do we invest? We are going to face now many situations like this. The markets have changed. We said that it's turbulent. So there you need finance to make these assessments and say, yeah, a business is risky. We invest money. We expect these returns. It's not the finance of cost control. It's the finance from a business perspective, making the decision. How much, what is the risk? What is the appropriate return? And how much risk are we willing to take? And I think it's very important, and you will see that everybody, when we talk about sales and operations planning, we always want to involve finance precisely to do that. And I emphasize, it's not finance from a cost control point of view, it's finance from a point of view of what are the economic returns, the economic value that we're going to create here. So thank you very much, Eric, for the question. It's a very, very interesting, very important one. Then let me go on to the following chapter. The next chapter in the book is a lot about what is relations across companies, what Kim was introducing about, what about the ecosystem. Now, we did look in that, and you will find some examples about what Lego did and so on. And it's very important because it talks about the partnerships between customers and suppliers, both on the side of the customers and on the side of suppliers. And now, why is this even more relevant than before? Is because something has happened during the pandemic that was totally unexpected. Everybody expected that Amazon was going to be the big winner. The reality is the big winner has been another kind of companies. Those companies who use the stores as part of the supply chain, as delivery points. Recently, if you read the news, it was interesting that Walmart in the US is partnering with 7-Eleven and CVS to deliver to the customers. They are actually not partnering in order to sell, they are partnering in order to get a delivery point, or a point where consumers could come and pick up precisely the products. So what we have seen during the pandemic is, first, on the customer side, a total change in the delivery, in the supply chain or the delivery chain to the customer, with a lot of partnerships, trying to understand how do we complement each other, how do we work with each other. If you go back in the chain, it's even more. We're talking about the example of Toyota partnering with the suppliers, being able to deliver. And now we see more than ever the idea, how do we work across companies, as extremely relevant. And we see that not only relevant from the point of view of just is the situation, but is looking forward. What are the co-investments that we're going to do? And it's extremely important because there's one change, though, that is much more difficult than what was before. Before, we used to say, let's partner with the big suppliers. And actually, what we did, we concentrated on a small set of suppliers, and we concentrated on a small set of customers. Did that make sense? Absolutely. Companies needed to concentrate on the big, what we call as basic suppliers. What has happened now is that sometimes the small suppliers, the ones that are very small, are the ones creating the challenge. So now we need to even to boost that capability, to partner not only with the big ones, but also to try to understand and to work with the small ones. Let me use the ultimate example that to me was a mistake and that show some people didn't understood that. You remember at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was putting a lot of reliance, rightly so, on the vaccines. And governments, the European Union, the US government, everybody was after the pharma companies, having contracts with them, buying the vaccines even before they were fully developed. There's one incident I remember in which one company, one of these pharma companies, couldn't deliver. They couldn't deliver because of the risks involved with that. And the reaction of a government official was, we are going to sue you because you didn't deliver the drugs on time. That's exactly what you shouldn't do. Exactly. The other counterexample that to me was a masterpiece of this partnering was a country like Israel. They got the first vaccination. And everybody was like, wow, they did a great job. Yes, they did a great job because they did a very good partnership with the pharma company. What did they do? They went to the pharma company and they look at what are the challenges that you have. As a pharma company, the first challenge is we only want to deliver if this is safe. If not, we're going to have a lot of lawsuits. It's going to be a drama. So on one side, we want to be fast to save lives. On the other side, we need to be very cautious. What did the Israeli government do? First of all, don't worry, we'll take the risk. Oh, if you take out the risk, I can go. And second, what else do you need? And the company said, oh, it would be great if we could have a lot of data about what is happening, secondary effects, etc., to try to improve. And of course, because everywhere data is protected, privacy is protected, we don't have that. The Israeli government said, this is an emergency situation, we'll give you all the data, all the secondary effects, everything that's happening. What was the consequence? Well, Pfizer, it was obvious for them, the best country to go first was Israel. They were going to be able to test, to get more information, to improve, to save lives. So that was the idea of partnering. So I think that precisely what has happened is that this has become even more relevant than before. And this is why in that chapter, we go specifically about sharing risks and rewards between customers and suppliers. It's exactly what happened there. And it's one of the challenges still today. We in supply chains, in particularly, we are not still very good at doing that. So to me, that's one of the key lessons. And I remember when I was looking at what was going in the supply chain of the vaccine, I thought, wow, that was exactly a masterpiece of what to do and also a masterpiece of what not to do. Kim, I see you assenting. Very interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you left also this, the gold sort of jewel to me this about becoming an attractive customer to your key suppliers is still, of course, very relevant, right? And companies are also working with that either directly, even some are measuring it, right? And we see the importance of that. So I also acknowledge that we did a survey also, again, coming back, I'm sorry, to disruptions and resilience. So the single most important factor in the companies we found in our global survey on who did the best was the one with the strongest relations with their suppliers. Right. So so what we see is that you might have all the IT technology, everything, right? When when major disruption hit you in your supply chains, these IT systems are, if not worthless on the short term, they are not completely trustworthy, right? But if you have a strong relation with key core suppliers, they are willing to help you, right? And then it's about the personal relation, and so we have seen that. We have evidence for that in our research, and so in this book chapter, there are many good cases around this, and I often use still the Frecon case, the Frecon North case, which is a great story about the evolution of a relationship between Frecon and North and how the attractiveness over time changed because of things that happened, right? Like substitute people coming into the relations, new technology innovations, right? And so on and so forth. And while I was at IMD, I developed a model together with Carlos and Tom Vollman on this also. So how we looked at attractiveness, and I still do widely used model actually, is that it has a component of value, right? So the value you get from your business partner obviously is very important. Then it has a component of trust. Trust is, as always, a very important factor, and we have multiple dimensions of trust. So you can have trust in the abilities of your partner, you can have benevolence trust, and also trust in relation to integrity. And the final factor that is very important is dependence or power. And the thing is that it's the combination of those three that somehow creates attraction. Meaning, one example, so imagine that you are not completely trusting your partner, right? And there is a high dependence. Then it creates risk that sort of, although you might get a lot of value out of that relation, it's simply a too high a risk for you. So what is the message here? Is it only academic babbling? No. The message is that you need to think about all those factors and even more, and their combination, and you need to work with them, and you need also, as Carlos said, to identify not only the big suppliers but the keynotes in your network where you need to work on these relationships, right? So yeah. So I think this is sort of I think the key message for me in this chapter 4 is that you can have all the systems, all the processes in place, but if you don't have the right relationships, then it doesn't work really, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. So then the last one is about supply chain alignment, and that's very much there are some examples that are very, very relevant today. So one of the examples that we use is an example about mass customization. And to me, it's interesting because now everybody is talking about personalization. Everybody's talking about personalized medicine. Everyone's talking about being much more focused. And the rise of e-commerce has brought precisely the idea of how do we make sure that actually we are much more personalized. But the overall theme is precisely saying, how do we align the supply chain to the business? And there are several things happening that are very important. The first one, as we said, retailers are in a huge change. And the huge change is that you will see that for many of them, the store has become part of the supply chain. Let me take one example, a very well-known company, Inditex, the owner of Zara, the fashion Spanish company. Now, actually, they sell a lot online, and most of the delivery actually is what is called click and collect. People go there. So how do you align the supply chain to something that was delivering to a shop to deliver to a customer through the shop? And that's very important because one thing is to deliver a full pallet with a lot of products. Another thing is individualized delivery. It's a very different ballgame. So you need to adapt that. Similarly, it's happening to many companies that are saying, well, I sell food through retailers, but what about selling food directly to consumers? And then what you find is that there is a lot of companies think about direct to consumer. How do we go directly from our company to the consumer without passing through the retailer? Not because they want to skip the retailer, but because this is what the consumer is asking for. So as a consequence, suddenly the supply chain that was designed for pallets, for tones, and so on, should be designed for the small things. We use one example. It was very, very interesting. There's a company in Italy who is they sell actually helmets for motorcycles and so on. And to me, it was interesting because during the pandemic, sales didn't go down in the sense of demand, but they went down because they said all of our supply chain was designed to ship a full pallet to a shop. We were able to sell online, but actually our logistics, our supply chain was not designed for that kind of delivery. So we were not able to deliver, although the demand was there. So think about that. The change that means we are going to sell through a different channel. We are going to sell in different volumes. And that makes a huge change. Many of the initiatives that we have seen about mass customization, although initially we have seen some of them succeed and some of them not succeed so much, what we see today is also that it's not the customization of the product in itself, it's the product and the service. As marketing people would say, it's the augmented product. It's not just the product, it's also the service around that. But that means from a supply chain point of view, a huge change. And actually, that change is so big that if you think about the evolution in the last years, what has happened to a company like Amazon today, and that's the interesting insight, many people will claim is a supply chain company. It's not a retailer. It's not an e-tailer. Actually, more than 50% of the sales of Amazon is from products that they don't own. It's simply they are the platform through which other companies, what they call third-party sellers, they sell the products to the consumers. And actually, Amazon, they do a fantastic job in the delivery, in the logistics, and so on. So that's basically something that you would say it has changed. As a consequence, you need to align the whole supply chain. And what you see there is basically a lot of developments. Kim was talking about technology. You see a lot of robotics, a lot of things going on. So there is a lot of different things going on in the sense that you need to align the supply chain to what the consumer is now asking for. And what we have seen in the last years is a lot of changes. So Kim, I see you saying, nodding. So if you could elaborate on that also.
Yeah. So yeah, it is about the constant change. And the question we ask is how we can align the supply chain to the business. But you could also say that even also today, this is still relevant, right? But it's also about how the supply chain opportunities, as we say already in the first chapter, the business can align to them, right? So it's also the other way around, basically. And one thing is also this about being able to, in order to be able to align these two things, probably you also, of course, need to have multiple supply chains, right? You have multiple, say, that offer different value propositions, or as Melnick said in one paper some years ago, outcome-driven blends. So you have different value propositions with different performance criteria for your different markets. And that comes again with some dilemmas, which we have in another chapter, that how can you manage that also from an incentive point of view, right? So and in order to to do that, you also need constantly to be aware and to rethink your supply chain, to have processes in place where you get ideas for process innovations and so on and so forth. So really still very relevant. And we need also to think about the other way around, right? How the supply chain is a weapon and the business can see that and leverage from that, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. So there is one question that is a very relevant one, which is, what about circularity or the reverse supply chain? Now, that's a big one. So let me clarify a little bit a couple of issues here, because it's a very relevant one. It's not in the book, and today I don't think that we couldn't write a book about that. Let me explain why. When we write a book, particularly, we write a book about things that are happening, what companies are doing. I always, and Kim knows that, I always joke a little bit saying that we are thieves. We steal the ideas what companies are doing. We put that together and we call this research. And then we publish it. And this is a book in which basically everything is based on what we see companies doing. So there's a lot of companies trying to work on circularity and trying to work on the reverse supply chain. Now, there are few companies that have done a great job, very few. And actually, we are trying to write cases about them. So hopefully, in 2 or 3 years, we will be able to write about that. But let me go deeper into that. The first thing about circularity, I think that there are different things. And as you know, in sustainability in particular, when we talk about supply chain, there is the first thing, it's reduce, then reuse. And one of the factors that we have today is that there is a lot of recycling, but the recycling in some areas is not so effective. A very simple example, a phone. Switzerland is a country that is good in trying to recycle them. So that means that around 80% of the electronic components, electronic material ends up in a recycling place. But when you recycle, you only recover around 24% of the material. So that means that still, if you do a perfect job on trying to recover that, still only 70% is lost. I think that we have a problem on designing the product. There is a new concept appearing, which is a very interesting one that we'll see developing in supply chain, is the concept of sustainability as a service. There are some companies starting to do that, and we'll see as how it develops. So the concept is good. Some companies are doing that. Let me explain exactly what it means. It means rather than me, equipment manufacturer, selling you a motor, I'm going to sell you the energy of the motor. I'm going to sell you what the motor does. Then still is on my balance sheet, and I have an incentive to make it as efficient as possible because you're paying me for the use of it. It's like I don't sell you a car, therefore I'm just selling you movement from point A to point B. Same idea as car sharing. The consequences as a car manufacturer, I don't want to sell you a big car, very expensive, that uses a lot of gas. I want to sell you an efficient process. And probably I will design the product in that way. When we go then to reverse logistics, it's a huge challenge. Several companies are trying. And the issue there is a very important one, is going back to the idea of the ecosystem that Kim was mentioning. You need a public-private partnership. The challenge is, how do we get back the products? Let me use a very simple example. Everybody says, we have a problem with plastics. True. The big problem that we have quite often is not recycling the plastics that technically is possible. There are companies more and more doing that. How do we take them back? That's the issue. How do we make sure, still in countries like Switzerland or Denmark, they have a lot of, I would say, a very well-organized infrastructure. Still taking that back takes a challenge. In other countries, it's even a bigger challenge. So if you go to companies, soft drink manufacturers, they say, we want to recycle that. And you go to plastic manufacturers, they say, we have the equipment, we have the capability now to do that. The challenge is that part. How do we go not to the consumer, but from the consumer back to reusing that and recycling that? There is a whole set of challenges. There are new supply chains that don't exist. Let me be very honest. They don't exist today. We need to create them. And it's not obvious how to create that efficiently. And I say efficiently not from the point of view of cost effective, but from the point of view of being able to recover all of this and bring that bit back. There's a very simple example. I was talking about phone. Some of you have heard about the Fair phone. Now, the Fair phone, somebody says it's a success, somebody says it's a failure. So we're starting in the Netherlands. And the idea is a phone that actually is modular. And if the camera becomes obsolete, you put another model, you reuse the rest. Some people say, well, they have not sold more than 100,000 units last year, so it's not so much of a success. If you talk to the founder, he would say, yes, it is a success. We didn't want to make a business. We wanted to make mobile phone manufacturers to have the right to repair. And it is true, since last year, the iPhone, Apple, they have taken that into account. So you can repair it. Think about that. Most phones, you want to change the battery, you can't. You need to go back to the manufacturer, it's complicated and so on. So the idea is, how do we do then create the supply chains for that? In particular, the reverse supply chain to take the product back from the consumer to the producer and to redo that. Now, today, we don't have quite a lot of efficiency, but I think that in few years, we'll see them emerging and we'll see them effective on that. Kim, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So I just wanted to add, at the moment, we're running quite a big project here at CBS on sustainable procurement, right? And there's also this coming back to the relationship part, right? That this is also still a major issue. So who will pay the bill, right? Basically, because a lot of this about circularity would require, of course, it will require adjustments, right? So you go to a supplier and say, okay, can you do this in a little bit using a different packaging material? And then how can you go about this? And then they will say, who will pay the bill, right? And so we are even there. We are back to basic, right? About how sharing of the cost on this. So that's one issue we found in all of the companies. So very simple, basic things, right? Another thing is this about if we are truly circular, then we need to think across supply chain. So the waste from one supply chain gets the raw product in another supply chain, right? And that is also complicated. So someone needs to think about this, and we have examples, but not that many. So one example I also know of, which is a very simple one, is that the coffee grounds from the coffee filters gets to grow mushrooms in another chain and so on. And we have a lot of examples. But some people needs to invest time and also money. There's also a question of money and adjustments, right? So relationships matters also a lot here.
Yeah, to finalize on that topic, it's one that is taking, I would say, it's something that for the first time in the last 2 years, companies are taking that extremely seriously. And I say extremely seriously because until, I would say, 2-3 years ago, most companies were reporting, but trying to be a good citizen of the world. But now the big dramatic change has been they are investing heavily on that. And they are dramatically changing the supply chains. And that's something that we didn't show before. I think that now the challenge quite often is, and that's why it's very, very important. And I'm sorry to say that, but sustainability happens in the supply chain. If you think about climate change, what it happens is in the supply chain. You go to many companies, most of the impact is in the supply chain, and quite often with suppliers, with transportation. That is where things happen. So to me, there is one part which is very important about reporting, about engaging with different stakeholders, but where you make, and there I'm taking the view of an engineer, where does it happen? It happens there. And there I think that there is a lot of things being developed. We are logically writing cases, writing research about that. And I hope that in a couple of years, we can publish maybe a book about that. However, today, there is not so much, I would say, documented that you could say these are the best practices. So the book that we're talking about is that the best practices documented that are in supply chain. Now, hopefully, and I remember that some of the editor publishers were asking us, when are you going to publish the next edition? I think that the next edition should incorporate that, but there's still, we don't have the evidence of so much best practices. We know the challenges, but not the best practices. So summarizing, that is a book that I would say probably today is one of the best books in supply chain. Surprisingly enough, because a lot of things during COVID had brought us to what I call advanced basics. I always say it's not that the basics are simple, it's that the basics are complex and are being challenged. And that's what we see. And I think that it contains a lot of the things that need to be done today. So this is why we choose the book. There are many other books but I would say that that one is so much based on what companies have done, how it is done, and what are some of the fundamentals that you need to put in place in supply chain, that I think that is probably still today one of the best books in supply chain. And it's not because we, Kim and myself, we are the author. Any last question? And if not, we'll close it. I say that Eric says, great session. Thank you very much. Any other question that you could write? If not, feel free to write us later on, and we'll try to answer or provide at least some reflections about your questions. So I want to thank you, all of you, for joining us. It has been a pleasure to get us here. And actually, we were commenting that it was a pleasure for me to be able to have also a conversation like that with Kim. We have not talked for a few months. We saw last time each other in September in Denmark, and now we had the opportunity to talk with each other and with you. So thank you very much, and have a great day, a great evening, depending on where you are.
And thank you also from me, and thank you, Carlos, for an interesting talk. So
thank you very much.